Alright, greetings everybody, and welcome to part 2 of my mini-series, if you will, on Canada during the First World War. This lecture is going to start right at the Battle of Vimy Ridge, and so I'm not going to get into the details of the logistics and the tactics of this battle because I did that in great length in Canada in World War I Part 1. So if you've just jumped into this lecture, I'd strongly recommend going back and watching the first part because certainly we'll do all the lead-up pieces that explain how Vimy Ridge rolled out. Now, it's fair to say that the Battle of Vimy Ridge, you know, in American history and French history, maybe even to a certain degree in British history, might not be too much on the radar. It might get a passing mention in a history book. But certainly in Canadian history, this is the Battle of World War I. Now, that is not to say that Canadians were not elsewhere. We were in the Battle of Ypres, or Ypres. We were in the Somme. We would later be in Passchendaele. But of all those battles, there was something very, very unique that happened at this ridge. And I think it has been often stated that Vimy Ridge is the place where Canada became a nation. I don't think that's an exaggeration. I mean, I think for Canadians it was a tremendous victory. It was a tremendous opportunity for Canadians at home to get excited about, and certainly for the French and British. It gave them something to be excited about, because you have to remember that the World War I on the Western Front was more or less a battle of stalemate. Every now and again, the enemy might gain 5 yards or lose 20, and you know, hundreds of thousands of young men are dying for literally meters of gain. So anytime there is an opportunity to demonstrate success in the war, however small, however great, it would be done. But the Battle of Vimy Ridge was more than just sort of a brush fire battle, more than just the gain of a couple feet or a couple meters. This was something entirely different. So for Canada, of course, this put us on the map, certainly with our allies as well. The performance of the Canadians at Ypres and the Somme was considered exceptional in the British High Command, so the reason we got Vimy was because we had already developed a reputation for being tremendous fighters, shock troops. The task of taking Vimy Ridge, the strongest defense on the German front line, was handed to the 4 Canadian divisions under the leadership of British General Julian Byng. So those 4 divisions were sort of under the leadership of Byng, but each division had a leader as well. Arthur Currie, as we mentioned in the last lecture, would be a leader of one of them. On Easter Monday, April 9th, 1917, at the break of morning, the battle would commence. Now, if you remember from last time, we talked about the Vimy Glide, that instead of these troops heading up together at the same time, they're going to sweep up like this, like a broad sweeping motion. In addition, they're going to be staggered, where artillery is going to do its work, then the infantry will move, then the artillery and the infantry. Artillery means the gunfire, the bombs. Infantry means the men on the ground, you know, literally walking up the ridge. You know, the only thing that alerted the Germans that the Canadians were coming at that point was the fact that it had been a relatively cold evening the night before, and all the puddles had frozen over, so as they moved their way up, you could hear the snap, crackle, pop of the ice breaking on the puddles as they worked their way up. In perfect formation, all 4 Canadian divisions, 33,000 men in total, proceed with their highly organized tactics. And in 45 minutes, the 1st and 2nd divisions achieved their goals, and the 3rd and 4th would take another 3 days. So, you know, and probably the delay of the 3rd and 4th was just part of that sweeping motion that the Germans finally figured out that what the Canadians were doing were kind of almost flanking them in a way, but not realizing that these other divisions were coming up too. So by the time they figured it out, the 3rd and 4th divisions had a little bit more of a fight, but the fact that this ridge was in Canadian hands, entirely in 3 days was truly remarkable. And it's truly remarkable because of this, because since 1914, when Germany took the ridge, British and French armies had lost over 200,000 men in various battles trying to take it. So for 3 years there had been attempts to take the ridge, and for 3 years 200,000 Allied troops had died in the process. So truly remarkable. At a cost of 10,000 casualties, the ridge was in Canadian hands in 3 days. And the French call it a gift from Canada, you know. And I had the great pleasure of going to Vimy in the spring of 2018 with my family. And it is a truly remarkable sight. I mean, you really get an appreciation for the scope of the landscape. And just how much the French absolutely, you know, love Canada. And certainly the people in the area where we stayed, when we told them we were there to see the site, they were, you know, saying how beautiful it was and so forth. So definitely as a Canadian, it's something you should have a look at, is that monument at Vimy. Vimy Ridge is referred to as the battle in which Canada became a nation. Once again, it sounds like an overused cliche. It has been stated many times, often repeated, but it's true, because not only were Canadians filled with pride, but the rest of the Allied forces, even the Germans, after Vimy, had developed quite a begrudging respect for the Canadian troops as well. So, all right, Passchendaele. So, as a result of Vimy, Byng was promoted and Currie became a general in his own right, the first to command Canada's troops. Okay, so now he has risen in the ranks as a result of this incredible victory at Vimy. Currie brought a distinctly Canadian point of view to the British war effort, but Currie still took orders from Douglas Haig. So Douglas Haig was still his commanding officer, and you know, remember that Currie had to kind of tug and pull with Haig in order to you know, get full confidence in the preparations for the Battle of Vimy Ridge, including having to have all those maps issued for their soldiers. So what I mean by distinctly Canadian point of view is that the Canadians at that point, particularly under Currie, were really beginning to think of this war and how to fight it in a different way than the British command. That the Canadians, and I'm sure others, the Canadians weren't alone in realizing that a war of attrition was not working, and a war of attrition is just that, you know, constant sending boys over the top kind of a thing. So the next move, of course, for Canada would be Passchendaele. Haig was convinced of the need to take Passchendaele despite there being little strategic value. You know, Haig is looking for any victory, however symbolic, however minuscule. A victory is a victory. In addition, Haig's earlier assault on Passchendaele had left massive shell craters, which heavy rains turned into a quagmire. Soldiers and even horses often drowned in these conditions. This is what Passchendaele, the Battle of Passchendaele, or the Third Battle of Ypres, I believe it's also called, is so horrendous, is that the previous summer they had pounded the area with artillery, and what happens is when the bombs drop, you get all this loose soil, right, and potholes and loose soil everywhere. Well, when torrential rains come, you can imagine all those potholes fill with loose mud, and it turns to almost like a sticky sort of quicksand almost kind of effect, because conditions were so bad that if you know, slipped or fell or walked down the wrong path or slipped off the board that you were walking on, you could literally sink into this horrible quagmire. There was times where horse and carts would go missing, or they would basically sink, and there was nothing anybody could do to stop it. So you can imagine trying to fight a war. I mean, give you an example. What the Canadians finally figured out what to do in terms of in the trenches in between is to lay down these boards so that you can at least walk on the boards, you know, and work your way through the territory. The moment you slip off that board, though, you could be sinking. And if you're sinking in the mud or stuck, somebody might offer you their rifle end to pull you up, or a hand or whatever. But if you end up getting pulled in, there are examples of soldiers that were giving their hand to their comrade to pull them out of the mud, and they themselves would fall in, but fall in head first. And I mean, you can imagine just the chaos of trying to just live in these conditions, let alone fight a war. Whoops. Curry protested that casualties would be high, and he was right. He basically told Haig that he didn't think Passchendaele was a great idea, that in fact the figure that he gave for the projected casualties of Canadians were almost exactly what they were. While a military victory, it lost 15,000 Canadian lives and nearly 500,000 soldiers from both sides. So, once again, and the tragedy of Passchendaele was the fact that Vimy Ridge had kind of proven that the war could be fought differently, that there were other ways to win battles, reduce casualties, claim victories, not just a couple of meters of mud. But anyway, so here we are. Tending to many of these soldiers included the women from the 2,500 who joined the medical and ambulance corps. So women were absolutely essential on the battlefront. And you know, in the initial stages, the field hospitals, if you will, would be close to the trenches, and of course they're getting bombed out, which is tragic. So they ended up moving these field hospitals back, but the medical corps was central. The nurses were referred to as bluebirds after the color of their uniforms, and these nurses worked in battle zones and in hospitals in Britain. So a lot of Canadian women working on the front. A number became casualties and were killed by artillery, bombs, and gas. So, all right. Well, you know, so much of our emphasis is placed on the war on the Western Front, but as you know, or might not know, there were battles being fought in East Prussia with the Russians. There were battles in the Alps between the Italians and the Austrians. There were naval battles off the coast of Africa. I mean, you know, down in the Mediterranean at Gallipoli, in the Dardanelles, the straits that connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. I mean, this was truly, you know, a global war. Maybe not to the extent of the Second World War, but still, we'd never seen anything on this scope before. Other technologies. In 1914, planes were used for aerial reconnaissance, but within a year, pilots were armed and fired pistols and rifles at enemies below. It's interesting that in the very early stages of the war, airplanes were not necessarily viewed as a way to bomb enemies, if you will. Really, they were thinking that reconnaissance, you fly over, you see where troop movements are, you see where encampments are, you can get a sense of how well fortified they are, and so on and so forth. But of course you're getting shot at, so the pilots would go up with a pistol, you know, fly the plane and shoot, which is ridiculous. And eventually they would add a second sort of cockpit, if you will, for a secondary person who then would be responsible for, you know, handling the machine gun. And usually, you know, they could be on a bit of a swivel so that it could be moved up and down and across and so forth. So soon both sides mounted machine guns and dogfights became spectacular sights. As you know, when we talk about, you know, Baron von Richthofen, or the Red Baron as he was known, or Billy Bishop, Canada's ace, it became, you know, fighting in the air was a completely different kind of battle, because you're facing the enemy one-on-one. Well, sometimes if there's a few of them, you could be facing a couple airplanes at once, but you know, people used to watch from the ground, and it was almost like entertainment to watch these dogfights and planes flipping around and swiveling around. One of the amazing things about the technology, and I still don't understand how they did this, but you know, you could have a gun in the back shooting from behind at things in front of you, but ideally you wanted to be able to shoot a machine gun in front of you where you see the planes coming at you this way. And I'm not sure how they did this, but it was figured out. I'll have to look it up. Maybe you can look it up as well. It'd be a very interesting thing to look into. Mounting a machine gun at the front so that the release of the bullets would be timed to occur within the brakes of the propeller, which seems unbelievable because those propellers are going so fast. How the heck they figured out to time it in 1914 to 18 is beyond me. But anyway, something to look into. Very remarkable. More than 50,000 pilots and aircrew were killed between 1914 and 18. And Canadians did not have an air force, so they joined the Royal Flying Corps. And Billy Bishop became Canada's most famous ace. There he is there. At sea, Britain's navy could not be matched, but the German U-boats posed a serious risk to shipping of all kinds. You know, the Germans were really at the forefront of U-boat technology in the First World War, and certainly, of course, in the Second World War as well. And, you know, shipping that was coming from North America to Britain was constantly under siege and constantly being sunk. And in those days, we didn't really have the technology, although it is developed as the war goes on, but in the initial stages, there was no way of knowing where these U-boats were, and they could just hide underwater and wait for a ship and then sink it. In 1915, a U-boat sank the British passenger liner Lusitania, killing 1,200 passengers. Later, the Germans would claim they did it because they received information that suggested that the Lusitania was filled with war materials. Either way, knowing that there's 1,200 civilian tourist passengers on this thing, and you still have the audacity to shoot it out of the water is pretty despicable on many, many levels. And so I don't think there can be any justification for this. Now, playing the devil's advocate, I am personally surprised that people would be willing to travel as tourists across the North Atlantic under these conditions, and by no means am I suggesting, you know, this was deserved or anything like that, but just the point that for me personally, I don't think I would take that kind of a risk anyway, but very, very tragic. And as a result of this, we see an incredible surge of anti-German sentiment. I mean, anti-German sentiment was already there because of the war, but the sinking of the Lusitania really makes it much more intense in Canada. In 1917, the Germans implemented unrestricted submarine warfare, and the Allies created the convoy system and underwater listening devices that help locate and destroy U-boats. So basically what happens in 1917 is the Germans do two things to antagonize the Americans, because remember, the Americans are not in this war. There is a strong strain of isolationism, which means the desire to stay out of foreign affairs as much as possible, isolate from war. And two things really anger the Americans to get them involved. Number one, when the Germans declare unrestricted submarine warfare, which basically means that we are no longer going to even bother trying to figure out which country the ship is from. If there is a ship coming up the North Atlantic towards Europe, we are going to sink it. And in many ways, I think unrestricted warfare could be seen as kind of a passive-aggressive declaration of war on the United States. But it was the intrigues revealed in something called the Zimmerman Telegram, which is interesting. Apparently, a cable was intercepted between Berlin and Mexico City, whereby something to the effect that the German High Command was inviting Mexico to get involved in a war against the United States, and if they did, they would carve up, Nevada, New Mexico, and Arizona, or California together. Something ludicrous like that. Now, no offense to Mexico, but they were in no position in 1917 to go to war against the U.S., nor are they now for that matter, but it was the mere audacity of the suggestion that made it impossible for the Americans not to declare war. So the intrigues revealed in the Zimmerman Telegram, as well as unrestricted warfare, sees the Americans finally get involved, declare war in April of 1917. Halifax became an important departure point for Europe, and Canada's merchant marine became involved in the dangerous work of ferrying munitions and food to Britain. Very similar set of circumstances as the Second World War. All right, well, the fact that this war continues to go on and on and on is having putting tremendous pressure, if you will, on Canada, on the economy, on Canadians at home. And in 1916, Robert Borden finally replaces the Shell Committee. That was that committee which was organized by Sam Hughes And out of that came the macadam shovel and the rubber boots and the Ross rifle. So, and you know, and Sam Hughes had given all his profiteer friends contracts, and it was just a gong show. So he said, we're going to replace the Shell Committee with the more efficient Imperial Munitions Board, where factories began building ships and airplanes as well as shells. Sir Sam Hughes would be quietly released from his duties, and he held a tremendous amount of resentment towards that. But looking at the evidence of what occurred under Sam Hughes's leadership as the Minister of Militia, it was likely the right thing to do. But certainly Hughes would harbor a lot of resentment about that. This production employed thousands of Canadians, and the exports of lumber, nickel, copper, lead, wheat, and beef reached record highs, but these products became scarce at home, resulting in rising prices locally. Isn't it ironic, if you think about it, that we sent so much of our staples, you know, food staples, to the front, that there had been shortages at home, which of course leads to increased prices at home too. Profiteers made a killing with the inflated prices, unfortunately, but workers' wages did not keep pace with profits. Demands for higher wages and better conditions became a major issue after the war. One of the things is, you know, workers are getting restless because they're being asked to sacrifice and compromise while the factory owners are making a killing. Basically, workers were told, look, let's just get through this war, and you know, when the war is over, then we can talk about renegotiating wages and working conditions or whatever it may be. And in many ways, those promises that were alluded to during the war did not come into fruition after the war, and that leads to the Winnipeg General Strike. So if you look at the lecture after this one, Canada in the 20s, I go into great detail about the consequences of that has on labor issues in Canada after World War I. Paying for the war resulted in the sales of victory bonds. These could be cashed in with interest after the war, and implementation of an income tax. Isn't it interesting? The notorious income tax is born out of the pressures brought on by the Great War. And it stuck. You know, the income tax was inevitable. It was going to come, whether it be 1917 or 1927. It was on its way. In order to build a democracy with a strong social safety net, you have to have income tax. So, just inevitable. These initiatives did not raise enough money for Canadian government, so money was borrowed from the U.S. So we had to borrow money from the U.S. to pay for our contributions towards World War I. So. All right, and the role of women is incredibly important, and also the role of propaganda in Canadian society becomes part of the landscape of our country. A shortage of young men at home resulted in an increased demand for women in the workforce in all areas, including the Red Cross, fishing, farming, munitions, factories. Women were absolutely instrumental in taking up all the jobs left vacant by men who went to the front. And there was no way that our economy could have continued to plug away at all the things we were growing and all the things we were making to be sent over to Europe. So women were crucial in this process. By 1918, all women won the right to vote in federal elections in recognition of their patriotic efforts during the war. So, you know, it starts in 1917. And, you know, once again, suffrage was inevitable. It was inevitable that women were going to get the vote, and First Nations were going to get the vote, and Chinese Canadians and everybody else. But what the war does is it makes it happen quicker. So, to mobilize Canadians behind the war in general, propaganda was used to persuade people to support the war in magazines, posters, films, radio, and speeches in whatever way necessary. You know, it's interesting, a lot of my students say, propaganda, no, we couldn't have done that. That's what the Nazis used, and that's what Stalin used, and Mao, and the dictatorships used propaganda. Well, they certainly do use propaganda, but democracies have to use propaganda as well. And all propaganda means is to present a certain point of view and image to encourage people to remain positive behind the war effort. right? So, you know, it's just a part of the reality of making people feel that they want to continue to support the cause of fighting the war. Propaganda distorts the truth and is selective, like minimizing Allied casualties and inflating German ones, or demonizing the barbarity of the Germans was quite common. Some of the propaganda posters were pretty, you know, big gorillas carrying off, you know, women and so forth, and wasn't uncommon. What happens is this onslaught of propaganda, which is intended to mobilize people's attitudes towards supporting the war, the consequence of that, I suppose, is that it results in discrimination of Germans at home, and forced Berlin, Ontario, to change its name to Kitchener after the British War Secretary. On December 6, 1917, this event in Halifax is remarkable. A collision of two ships, one called the Mont Blanc, carrying 2,500 tons of dynamite, exploded, destroying much of Halifax and killing close to 3,000 people and injuring 10,000. Now, I believe this happened in the northern part of Halifax, not the whole city. But North Halifax was completely flattened. If you look at Halifax the day after the explosion, North Halifax anyway, you would think you're looking at a picture of Hiroshima or Nagasaki from World War II. It is unbelievable. 3,000 people were killed. Just, you know, the tragedy was that so many ships were coming in and out of Halifax at the time. So, you know, it's just one of those horrible consequences of having an extremely busy port. And it just so happens one ship that collided happened to have 2,500 tons of dynamite, and you can imagine it was almost like a nuclear explosion. All right, by 1917, many thousand Canadians had been killed or maimed, and Britain required more troops, but Borden had promised no conscription, which means compulsory enlistment for military service. Conscription is, or a draft is, a draft comes out of conscription. Conscription means that when you are given a letter in the mail that says you are to report to this office Friday at 5 o'clock, you have to report. It is against the law not to report. You would go through medical checks, and sometimes if you had a disability of some kind, either a mental health issue or you had a physical disability, you'd be excused from service, but if you were deemed as healthy, you would have to go. In 1914, we never thought we'd be in a position where conscription would be mandatory, but the demands of the war and the pressures we were receiving from Great Britain put Robert Borden in a very, very difficult situation. Men were not jumping to the queue by 1915-16. When people began to hear about the horrors of the trenches, when people began to see men returning home with half a face or no jaw or no arm or no leg or shell shock or whatever it may be, people were no longer jumping, you know, to get to the recruiting offices anytime soon. Under pressure from Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time, the British PM, Borden implemented the Military Services Act, or Service Act, a bill making enlistment compulsory. There were some exemptions. The Military Services Act was received with great division, and Quebec was not happy. Most French recruits could not speak English, and officers could not speak French. Now, this is one of many, many issues that the French Canadians were having, but initially what happened is that the French Canadian troops were being lumped in with all the other Canadian divisions, and all those Canadian divisions were having, usually British generals were running the show. And none of these generals could speak French, or maybe some could speak a little bit, but the French Canadians were totally perplexed. Well, you know, because some French Canadians were not bilingual. They spoke French, and they grew up speaking French, and when they had English officers leading them, they couldn't understand what the heck they were saying. So there's a lot of resentment about that. French Canadians saw the MSA as a means of forcing them to fight in a war they did not feel was theirs. Quebec nationalist Henry Bourassa thought Canada had done enough, and spending more on the war would destroy the economy, and that the Military Services Act would bitterly divide the country. You know, on that, I would say he was probably right. that the pressures of the war were going to reach a point where it was going to make people angry and resentful. How long that was going to take is hard to say, but it was already beginning to percolate and bubble under the surface. Prairie farmers, industrial workers, and Vancouver Island coal miners all opposed conscription. And, you know, the conscription crisis, as it became known in Canada, was a very, very contentious policy. Hostility to the MSA encouraged Board to call an election, but before he did this, he passed bills which allowed men and women serving overseas to vote, and he gave the vote to all women directly related to servicemen. So this was stage one of universal suffrage between men and women, because of course First Peoples would be denied for many more years, and certainly Chinese Canadians as well. So it was the beginning, right? It was saying, well, if you are married to a man on the front, you will have the right to vote. By the time 25,000 conscripted soldiers arrived in France, the war was near its end. And interestingly enough, so that cohort of Canadians who were forced to enlist and forced to go to Europe didn't have to fight, because the war was over before they got to the trenches. So luckily for them, they didn't have to fight. So theoretically, no conscripts, Canadian conscripts, fought in World War I, from what I understand anyway. All right, now the results of the war are plentiful. This is so much happens at the end. I have lectures on a lot of these topics. I'll point them out as we go through it, because I'm not going to be explaining them thoroughly here, because I'll investigate those things in other lectures. 1917, Tsarist Russia collapsed to revolution in March, and the following month the USA entered the war. This would be the beginning of the first communist state, and I have a lecture on the Russian Revolution. I have 4 lectures on that period, the Stalin period, and also I have a lecture on understanding Marxism and Leninism, which were the ideas that fueled the leaders of the Russian Revolution. The second one. This is the first one. There were 2 actually in that year. First one was led by moderates in March, but the one in November is when the Bolsheviks take over. They're the communists, and that begins the process of the Cold War, which of course dominates much of the 20th century. By 19, Germany was exhausted, and Germany signed an armistice at 11 o'clock on November 11th. I have another lecture dealing with Weimar Germany, and I talk about how the king, the monarch of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II, basically abdicates 2 days before, on November 9th. So he did not want to sign any armistice, and he'd rather cut and run. So power was handed over to democratic forces in Germany, and that story also very interesting. At the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was heavily punished. I have a lecture dealing with the Paris Peace Conference you can look at that goes into great detail about the Treaty of Versailles and its consequences. And Canada became a member of the League of Nations, which was based on the idea of collective security, meaning that nations will now work together to resolve problems, as opposed to, you know, forming 2 blocks of power in a balance of power type of system. Great idea. Woodrow Wilson of the United States was the architect of the idea of collective security in the League of Nations, although ironically the American people through Congress did not vote to ratify the Americans' inclusion in, or being part of, the League of Nations rather. U.S. did not join the League, there we go, nor did the organization have a military wing to stop aggression. This has all kinds of ramifications when you get to the 30s, and we begin to see leaders like Benito Mussolini violating, you know, certain moral laws by invading countries, and also Adolf Hitler would do the same thing. So, and if the war was not bad enough, hunger swept through Europe in the winter of 1918 into 1919, and a deadly virus known as the Spanish flu killed a total of 22 million people in Europe, and soldiers brought it to North America, where 50,000 Canadians died. Isn't it timely? And here we are in the midst right now of a pandemic in the world, the COVID-19 pandemic, but they did not have vaccinations. They did not have technology to identify who had it or who was vulnerable. They didn't. I mean, they would eventually quarantine and isolate and things like that, but 22 million people died from the Spanish flu after the war. In fact, more people died from the Spanish flu than the war itself. So truly tragic. And 50,000 Canadians died at home. All right, that being said, we're going to leave it at that. The next lecture will be entitled Canada in the 1920s. After that, I've got one on Canada in the 30s, and it'll just move forward like that when you'll eventually get to the Second World War. And we'll keep going until the early 21st century with this Canadian history series. All right, thank you very much. Appreciate you watching.